Well, I'm so excited to be here with Wendy and Michael, who both have seasons coming up here at the Joyce. And so I just wanted to get some introductions going. So, Wendy, can you just talk about your association with Trisha Brown?
I danced with Trisha in the 70s, and I've seen like every new work since then, which is a long time. And I'm involved in some of the alumni things, the education projects and the teaching. But I also do other teaching and other writing. But I've written about Trisha a lot, and I'm just very close to all of those amazing pieces she's made.
Fabulous. And Michael?
I'm Michael Novak. I'm the artistic director of the Paul Taylor Dance Company. And I've been artistic director since 2018, since Paul Taylor's passing, and I was a dancer in the company prior to that. I'm very excited about this conversation about Trisha, about Paul, about Robert Rauschenberg, and kind of the origins of modern dance and modern art in New York City in the 1950s, and what was happening at that time, which relates to both of the programs that are coming up here at the Joyce.
Perfect. So let's talk a little bit, as a perfect segue, about artists being able to relate to other artists.
Well, there was so much inter-genre work in the 50s, and I think it had to do with the personal relationships. There were very close relationships between artists like Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns, and choreographers like Trisha and Merce Cunningham, and there were very intimate relationships with some people. For instance, Robert Rauschenberg and Steve Paxton, and Steve Paxton was very close to Trisha Brown, and it sort of cross-pollinated. And there were things like Robert Rauschenberg saying, when he saw Trisha's rooftop piece, which stretched along like 11 rooftops in Soho, he said, Trisha thinks like a painter. So he saw that visual part of her. And she was thinking about her environment, living on the 7th floor on Worcester Street, seeing those rooftops. And she did. And Robert Rauschenberg sort of was a performer too. So there was a lot of crossover. There were people like John Herbert McDowell, who was a composer, but made performance pieces.
Right.
And James Waring was a big link between Paul Taylor and Trisha and David Gordon and David Vaughn. And he was someone who made dances and made visual collages and made costumes. So he was sort of an example of someone who didn't limit himself to one discipline.
Right. And how much do you think that inspired Trisha to open up what art is, what dance could be?
I think a lot. But before we get to what Trisha was inspired, which was really Judson Dance Theater, like in 62 and a little bit before that. But before that, there was the Dance Associates, that Paul Taylor was involved with, and David Vaughn, who was, I think even then, he was the archivist for Merce Cunningham. Merce Cunningham and John Cage were such a strong axis that influenced a lot of people. And at that time, the Dance Associates was a very loose formation of people that included ballet people too. Tanaquil Leclerc was part of it, Edwin Denby. And they just performed at different places around, like Henry Street Settlement and the Masters Institute. And Paul Taylor would be on the program with James Waring. And James Waring was a teacher and choreographer, as I said, who did stuff at the Living Theater. The Living Theater was another big influence, being like chaos and anarchy and different things happening that nobody could foresee. And then what happened in the Merce Cunningham studio was Robert Dunn, who was a protege of John Cage, came and taught a composition class. By then, Paul Taylor and Rauschenberg had already done their 9 pieces, I think, in the 50s.
They stopped collaborating. They started collaborating in 1954 and stopped in 1962.
So, and 62 is when Judson Dance Theater started. So, Rauschenberg was doing so many things all at once.
I think what's so amazing about that moment in history, like I think why I'm so fascinated about it as a lover of dance history, but also an artistic director, is like the geniuses that were connected at that time, like who were uncovering their own genius.
Yes.
Like how it was just, it felt like dance was so small and there was so much innovation happening at that time. And I'm wondering, because it's Trisha's 50th, and like what her entry point was through Cunningham, right?
Pretty much,
how did she come into her own through that branch of the family tree?
Yeah. Well, she had a work study scholarship at Morris Cunningham, and she would answer the phone, and Rauschenberg would call. You've probably heard this story.
It's amazing.
And she didn't even know who he was, but they would have these such great conversations. And who is that guy? And then I think she actually met him because he was living with Steve Paxton, and she was already probably doing things with Steve Paxton because they were it was 1960 when Robert Dunn started teaching at the Cunningham studio. So yeah, I think it was, and I think through Cunningham, because Robert Dunn was teaching in his studio, Yvonne Rainer took that class, Simone Forti, Steve Paxton, and Steve Paxton had actually been on scholarship with Jose Limon.
It's so incredible.
It's true. Yeah. But I think that the pedestrian thing, so there's the Rauschenberg thing, and one way I can connect Rauschenberg with James Waring is the collage aesthetic. That James Waring would make all these collages, and we saw some of them at the Museum of Modern Art recently, and Rauschenberg.
The combines.
The combines was the found object kind of thing,
Yeah.
and the collages on the wall, which later he put dancers in these collages. So it's a different way of making work. Like it wasn't just, we are going to show you what the center of the painting is.
Right.
It's going to be an all-over painting, like Pollock made an all-over painting, and then Morris Cunningham, people would talk about it all over space. So there was a lot of influence there, and I think very early on, Trisha went to a lecture of John Cage on indeterminacy, and she learned that this sort of chance method that you could do could disrupt your choices. So it wasn't just like, here's my personal choice. Oh, I love the candle being in the center, or whatever.
Right.
You just you throw chance in there, and it's throwing the wrench into the works. And Trisha loved that.
Fantastic. So, Michael, when you think about artists being able to respond and affect other artists, how does that come into play for Taylor kind of then and now for you?
So I think what's interesting when you look at the mid to late 50s for Paul, he was a founding member of Morris Cunningham's company. He joined the Martha Graham Dance Company, I think, in 1955. 1958, he was dancing with Graham. Clytemnestra was having its debut. He's painting the backdrop for Summer Space, Morris Cunningham work designed by Rauschenberg. 59.
And Paul Taylor is painting that?
Paul Taylor was painting the drop with Robert Rauschenberg because they were friends and they worked.
But I think it was actually John Jasper's idea to do the pointillist thing, and then Rauschenberg and Paul Taylor.
So like there's this circle there, and then at the same time that's happening, Paul's going to New York City Ballet, and he's dancing with Balanchine in episodes. So there's this, and then 1962 is Paul's last collaboration with Rauschenberg prior to making Oriole, and what's so fascinating at that time is I feel like Paul at that point was 24, 25. So in his mid to late 20s. And you see Graham, you see Cunningham in this early work. You see Graham, you see Cunningham, you see Balanchine, you see all these different voices influencing him, and then you slowly start to see him like, that's not for me. That's not for me. And you see that through line start to emerge, and that's where Oriole 1962 comes in.
And he was still dancing, right?
He was still dancing, yeah. And Paul was incredibly masochistic when it came to choreographing work for himself. He was incredibly long and tall and broad, and anyone who performs his solos, they're incredibly hard to do. And there's something about Paul, I think, challenging himself, challenging what dance was. And that was a conversation I think that was happening in this circle at the time. Like, what is art? What is dance?
Definitely, that was a conversation.
what is music? How are we defining it? Like, what is the focal point, or are there myriad focal points? Are there myriad sounds? So he's sitting in that conversation of, if you strip away all artifice, what are the ABCs of who I am as a choreographer? And for Paul, it was gesture. Paul landed on gesture. It wasn't chance. It wasn't Freud. It wasn't Greek myths. It was this. We in our postures and gestures communicate everything. But that was a decade of exploration to find that, and then with that became the seed going forward. I mean, what it means for the future. I mean, I think that sense of exploration, that sense of a community of artists asking questions and challenging each other and inspiring each other is something that I'm hoping to cultivate during my tenure as director. And like, who are those artists that you can bring together who are fuel for each other?
Right. Yeah.
And I want to go back to Trisha and Rauschenberg, because they collaborated for decades together, and like how that.
Well, they collaborated from 79 to at least 83. No, I think maybe later, maybe to the end of the 80s. But another way they collaborated was when you talk about artists sort of redefining things. So Rauschenberg did performance pieces, and because he was so turned on by seeing people try things out. And Trisha was in a couple of his performance pieces, and one of them called Nap Room 2. Attire is like an emblematic thing that he uses in so many pieces, a car tire. Yeah. Trisha was actually curled up inside a car tire in one of his pieces. And in another piece, he projected slides on her back. There were slides of the New York City skyline. So there were ways that she just jumped into whatever he wanted, and he jumped into what she wanted, and they would conceptualize together. And like for Glacial Decoy, which was the first piece she did for a proscenium stage in 1979, she wanted an expanse across the space. And he kind of took the idea of live decor, which he had with Merce Cunningham in this piece Story from 1964. And there, people could change costumes. There was one performance in England where the live decor was himself, Rauschenberg, and Alex Hay ironing costumes on the stage.
That's fabulous.
That was the live
That's
decor.
fabulous.
And actually, since then, the only one I know who's done live decor is Twyla Tharp, when she had the graffiti writers on the scroll going on. But the graffiti writers are part of the decor. So the photographs that he made for Glacial Decoy, which was 4 photographs at one time, kind of marching across the space, 4 seconds each. So there were several hundred. So that was kind of like, he used that idea of live decor that he had with Merce for Trisha's first piece on the stage. So, and then the second piece, Set and Reset, where he said, let's have the wings be transparent. That's also interrogating what a proscenium stage is.
Absolutely.
So all the dancers have to think about, well, when I'm behind the wing and it's transparent, am I performing or am I not performing?
Right.
So that kind of, she could depend on Rauschenberg for that kind of conceptualizing. That was just a back and forth relationship that they had.
That's really incredible. And just piggybacking off of what Michael said about gesture, let's go into the Jetson period.
Oh, well, it was the piece that Stephen Petronio did here at the Joyce was the piece of Trisha's was primary accumulation, group primary accumulation. And they just do gestures like this, gesture like this, gesture like that. So she would definitely take things from every day into the work. And that was encouraged by Robert Dunn in the composition class. It was also kind of a Bauhaus influence, like you take what you have near you.
Right.
He would say to the students, don't wait until you can get Margot Fontaine to do this movement. You've got to do it with your body.
There's no time.
Yeah.
Take it down.
So there's no time. So it's very much what you have. And that was that goes through all of Trisha's work. And I see that in Esplanade too, the pedestrian thing
Mm-hmm.
of using
Yeah.
that, although Paul used it in a more rhythmic way and
Right.
Trisha used it in a very even rhythm way.
Mhm.
But it was all part of questioning, like John Cage saying, what can be music? Any sound can be music.
Right.
And then dancers going, well, any movement can be choreography.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you have
There,
something?
no, there
Nicole?
was one of the dances that we're bringing to the Joyce is from Seven New Dances, which Paul premiered at the 92nd Street Y in 1957. There's a duet in it for two women that we're reconstructing, and it's the sounds of rain. And these two women are just standing there, and there's a breeze blowing, and they're just in 1950s, you could say like a lunch attire. And it's just a series of postures for about 6 minutes. And in how Paul writes about it is that in that exploration, and he meticulously noted every posture, every gesture, like everything was a choice. It's very, it is written out very clearly. And in his autobiography, he talks about how it was the realization that two bodies in space alone is a relationship. And the audience can't help but see something more. Even people
Right.
just standing there, you've
Right.
already
Right,
created
right.
a story.
Mhm.
And then where do you go from there? And watching events too, which is what it's called, is fascinating because if you know the second section in Esplanade, which is very quiet and dim and no one touches and it's very haunting, you see people, again, it's to Bach, but you see that in events too. It's like you get what he was studying and the impact of it, and he just put Bach to it, albeit 18 years later. But those early works, I think, are fascinating because I think that's where the artist is. They're building their ABCs. Like,
Yes,
they're
absolutely.
like,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Now, is that the piece that got the empty review?
yes, 7 New Dances.
Yeah.
Got
Yeah.
it was Louis Horst.
The blank space.
The blank review in Dance Observer.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that was that was pre-Judson. That was 1957.
Yeah.
But it was very much like a Judson thing of like, how little can you do?
Right.
Or, can you do a dance in 3 minutes that doesn't have much movement in it kind of thing? Or
Yeah.
Steve Paxton walking around and eating a sandwich.
It's there's a duet in 7 New Dances where the curtain went up, and Paul Taylor and Viola Farber, I believe, she was on the floor in a pose, and he stood there, and for 4 minutes they stood there, and then the curtain came down.
Was that the one called Epic, or that was Duet?
Epic was Paul's solo, where he did like an
it's a movie, right.
elaborate series of pedestrian postures. And Paul, and when you read Paul's notebooks, the investigation through observation of people, like how many different ways can one hold themselves, hold their arms, hold their feet, And I even heard stories, Paul, until his later years, he would sit outside, he would smoke, he would watch people, and he would get ideas for gestures. He would pull from people to make work. So I think that idea of found movement never left. It was augmented by visual artists and composers and different sized prosceniums, but I think it was with him to the end. And I remember specifically, like even his last work, and as he was choreographing it, like the specificity of a gesture was so important to him because it was real. It created a human connection.
The 4 minutes, was that a reference to John Cage's piece, 4 minutes and 33 seconds?
It might have been. I don't remember the timeline of those two.
I forget what year that was, but that was where he had David Tudor, the pianist, sit at the piano and like get ready for the piano, and there were actually 3 parts to it. So he put his hands down and put his hands up, and it was 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. And that was Cage's really conceptual piece, sort of philosophical piece, saying that what you hear is not silence, it's never silence, it's you hear ambient noise. So it sort of to make people listen.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it engages the audience in a way that had never, or I'm interested know, like, it changes how the audience watches dance and art.
Yeah.
It
Well-
forces them to engage differently.
Yes.
Yeah. And just to go back again to group primary accumulation, which was here at the Joyce, and it is an accumulation, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, and you're watching and you're counting and you're watching for the new moves, and then after 30 gestures, they move a quarter of a circle, and your eyes just are shocked because
Right,
you've been
yeah,
looking at
sure.
those 30
Right,
gestures in one
right.
position, and then
Right.
everything
Yes.
moves, and the elbows here and the legs there.
Right.
And she's sort of teaching us how to look,
Right.
how to look
Yes.
closer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I love that program because Stephen Petronio's work is also about looking closer,
Mhm.
looking closer to where they are engaging, where
Right.
the limbs are going.
Right. So Wendy, for you, like individually, and then we can talk kind of organizationally, what does the 50th mean? Like what is top of mind for you in this year?
Oh gosh, I was prepared to talk about the program that she's doing
We can
with
talk about that too.
with the
We can do that
Rauschenberg
too.
works.
Yeah.
But what Trisha means to me, a beautiful, deep, long artist. Over many years, the first time I saw her was in '71, and like knocked out by the people walking on the walls,
Mm-hmm.
how she changed our view of things.
Mm-hmm.
The falling dances she did with Barbara Dilley that were the most risky, adventurous thing I've ever seen two women do,
Yeah.
ever. And learning the way she moved and the way she made movement, the sensuality, the eye of how different things form and reform and clash,
Mm-hmm.
the faith in movement to speak without a narrative, and yet when she did the operas, she just jumped into narrative and
Right.
figured out how to apply her way of moving to the
Mhm.
opera narratives. She means to me a community of people, all of us alumni who are still doing things connected to the company, who have Trisha in our bodies.
Mm-hmm.
I think she also, I teach at Juilliard now, and Juilliard just did Set and Reset.
Yeah.
And I talked to the students about it. I gave them some background in it. I talked to them about what it means to them, how they feel Trisha's work has influenced dancers today. And they see it. They see the kind of movement and the kind of release in current choreographers as well. I just feel so lucky to have worked with her and stood next to her and done Spanish dance, pelvis to pelvis with
I
her.
love that. I love that. That's amazing.
So those are some of the things that she means to me, and a challenge as a writer. I've written several things about her, and how do I remember once I said, she shows the phrase as a solid, but she dances it as a liquid.
Oh, that's beautiful.
So you
beautiful.
have to
Really? Yeah. Wow.
that kind of fluidity.
Yeah.
You've got to get that in your body. It's more about how the energy travels through the body than the shape.
And that's very hard to do, by
Right.
the way.
By the
Yeah.
way.
That's
As
it's
an aside.
not easy to pull that off.
Yeah,
As an
it's
artist.
under. She used to say something like, "I grew up in Aberdeen, Washington, and I love the woods, and I learned that you come in through the back door." And whatever that means, you don't just come in through the front door. Here I am.
Right.
You slither in.
Right.
Mm.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of the aesthetic.
That's amazing. And then, so moving on to that, well, thank you for that. Thank you for bringing us into that and getting deeper into like your connection, because you're here and it's so much a part of you. She's so much a part of you. So I think sharing that is wonderful. Coming back to the program.
So I think the company has chosen to highlight Rauschenberg works, partly because, and the works they've chosen Foray, and Astral Converted. I think we're done here at the Joyce. I don't know if they were premiered here, but
Got it. Okay.
they were done here when she first came to the Joyce
Got it.
because she did a lot of work, not in proscenium stages or at Brooklyn Academy of Music,
Right.
but when she first started coming here, probably in the early '90s, these were the works that she did, and they're really interesting. And again, it was Rauschenberg helping her reconceive what a proscenium performance was. With Foray, the music is a marching band outside the theater. So when you're watching it, it's like hearing a siren or something. Like I don't have to be listening to that. I have to focus on the stage. But no, you focus. That's what it is. It's a marching band out. They're gonna circle the block here at the Joyce. So, and at the same time, the dance is very quiet, and Rauschenberg has given it these shiny costumes. And then the other piece is Astral Convertible. Sorry, that was the original name. It's Astral Converted, where he's designed these towers. I mean, they're not like the Eiffel Tower. They're sort of like this height, and they have sensors on them. And as the dancer passes by, it changes the light. And the sound is by John Cage. And I think Trisha always wanted to do something with John Cage sound. So those are the two pieces that
That's fantastic.
are going to be here.
I mean, I think it makes perfect sense for those to be like what's here for the 50th.
Yes.
And being able to give, I mean, her body of work is so extensive, but to be
Yeah.
able to give people that glimpse of the 50th, I think it's incredible.
Yeah, and it's also her conceptual self,
Right.
but also her sensual body
Yeah.
self. You see
Yeah.
that in every work of hers.
That's fantastic. So, Wendy, staying in this line of thought, is there anything else that you want to leave the Joyce audience with?
Well, I just have one memory that was told to me that I think is emblematic of how everything was all mixed up, kind of. And this comes from David Gordon, who recently passed away and who was very involved in Judson Dance Theater. But before he was involved in Judson, he was dancing with James Waring, the James Waring Company, in probably 1959 or so. And he described one piece of James Waring's where every person in the piece had a costume designed by a different person. And his costume was designed by someone named Pete. You know who that
I
is.
know who Pete is, yeah.
And Pete came in and put these big discs on him, and he was wearing tights, and he painted his crotch green. And later he found out that Pete was Paul Taylor.
That's amazing. I love that. I think that's I love that.
Yeah, and it was a great sort of link between James Waring and that whole group of dance associates with Paul Taylor and other people and Judson Dance Theater.
That's perfect. Great. Thank you.